I wanted to take my faith more seriously. I really wanted to get to the root of things, really try to understand historically, let's say, partly historically, but traditionally, what Christians have done and why. And I felt a little bit going to the churches that I was going to that it seemed almost like they were not as interested in digging to the deep roots of it. Now, there were some pastors and such, of course, who were interested in that, but it didn't always seem to then play out into the practice.
Okay, welcome everyone to the Orthodox Christian Podcast, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with Bronwyn Schuman. And for anyone listening or watching, Bronwyn, why don't you take a second to introduce yourself and tell everyone what you spend your time doing?
Thank you so much. Well, I'm a musician, primarily a musician, and so I've done my education through different places, and I've wound up here in Montreal. I'm from Calgary originally, and then I lived in New York for a few years when I did my master's there. And now I'm working on my doctorate in music at McGill University. So it's a performance doctorate. I'm a pianist, so I do mostly piano. But I also do research, and my research is in music education for children in an area called play-based learning, where you basically researchers observe children how they learn best, which is in their free play, and they derive their observations and kind of results from that for teachers and for parents and for children's benefit. So that's in the area of music education. So that's what I do, that's what I've done for my education. For work, I work as a teacher, teaching kids piano, voice, and theory, all of that. Also adults, not just kids. And I also work with other teachers. I do consulting and I teach a teacher's course. And then, as most musicians do, you do a variety of performing, recording, writing, presenting, this type of thing. So my performance is usually with singers, and so opera, classical style. I work with singers mostly, coaching and performing with them. And one other kind of more recent area of my work is that I'm a choir director at an Antiochian Orthodox Church here in Montreal. And I recently started a children's choir with them as well. So it's very nice. And it's great to be able to use your skills and talents to serve your church community in that way. So I guess that's the short and long of it.
Well, it's a wonderful overview of what you're currently doing. So tell us a little bit about your religious upbringing and what that looked like specifically in the home setting, but also in the more formal gatherings of the other believers, if there were other believers at the time, up to the point that you encountered the Orthodox Church.
Thanks. So I grew up a Christian Protestant. Both my parents still go to the same church that I grew up in, which is an Open Brethren church, if I'm not mistaken. And so Christianity really played a central role in the home for us. First of all, I have 3 older brothers. We were all homeschooled, and I would say that our homeschooling was very flexible. It wasn't necessarily religious homeschooling in any way, I don't think. But our home life was religious. So, for example, my parents weren't doing like a religious curriculum, if that makes sense. But our home life was religious. We prayed before every meal. We prayed at nighttime. Our dad read the Bible to us at night. We were always attending church events and various other kind of religious, events. And we attended church every Sunday. And the church that my parents go to, I mentioned, I asked my dad, I think they said it's called Open Brethren, but we never talked about that when we were younger. And it was basically, it kind of resembled what, I guess I should be careful in how I say this, but okay, so I'll just describe what it was like. We came together, my parents were, I think, like the second wedding at this church or something. So they had been there for a long time, and my parents were some of the younger adults there. So there were many, we grew up with a lot of seniors around us, or older, let's say retired people are in that age group. And basically we would come together on Sunday mornings. There would be one fellow who opened, which means started the initial topic, let's say, started the initial prayer. And then people would take turns in the rest of the church service, either standing up for a prayer, requesting a hymn, requesting a scriptural reading. So it's very much run, there was no head pastor, it's run by the elders of the church, and it very much kind of resembles like an older style, let's say, Bible study worship service. And we did communion every week. Their communion they did every week. And this continues, it still exists, and my parents go there, although the congregation is mostly elderly, so like really starting to dwindle a little bit. So that was the kind of church upbringing we had in our home and in our church life. I remember really liking church. I liked going there. I liked the music. I really liked the hymns, and I think I still kind of credit the Mary Bella. She used to play the piano in the hymn singing time that must have been the reason I wanted to play piano, because I hadn't encountered it anywhere else that I know of. So I think that I really, this earlier church experience, and that it continued through my childhood years, it stuck with me like as something very important, and my parents took it very seriously and were very involved. And then when I was around 11 or 12, I started going to a church in our neighborhood with one of my brothers, because all of our friends went there, and it was more kind of our friends who went there were from the same neighborhood, from the same kind of upbringing, this type of thing, whereas that wasn't the case for some of the children at the other church. And and our parents were totally okay with that, which is very interesting. They're like, sure. So we would walk every Sunday to the church down the street, and our parents would continue going to their church. And it was very interesting. I think that also made an impact on me, in that my parents have always just been happy that we're Christian. They've always been happy that we want to attend church. And that started from a very young age. It was just, if they want to go to this church, then we're not going to stop them. They seem to understand, I think. So I guess that might sum up kind of those key kind of points: church or Christian life in the home, and then childhood church upbringing, and then kind of preteen youth church experience.
Yeah,
and
that is helpful.
Oh, sorry, say that again.
I was just saying that is helpful.
Yeah.
Well, and I didn't mean to cut you off per se, but I was just going to reflect that I did speak with someone else who was raised in a brethren setting. I can't remember if it was closed brethren or open brethren, but Father Justin Hewlett, who's a priest in Vancouver, was raised brethren. And it was very similar to what you described, in terms of there wasn't a central leadership structure. There wasn't really a mechanism for that. It was more quote unquote organic, where people would just gather together and spontaneously request something or share something. And he appreciated sort of the stillness or the attentiveness to God that was present in that community. And if I can remember correctly, the difference between open and closed brethren was that open brethren was open to people from other brethren churches, I think, whereas the closed brethren, there was some sort of credentials needed, as it were, to transfer from one group to another group. They were a little stricter about that, and had a higher level of discipline, as it were. So I don't know if that rings true for you, but going from there to this other church, was that church part of a particular denomination?
Yes, I think they were Evangelical Baptist type. I think they do call themselves, they were a community church is what they called themselves, but I do think they were technically under the Baptist kind of heading, but not in a way that I experienced it so differently, because the church that my parents went to began as that open Brethren church. It ended up being that they also had a second service, which was more modern evangelical. So they had a pastor, they had worship bands, this type of thing. So they have both. And so I was also familiar with that area, that kind of more modern, with modern worship, let's say, and a pastor. And so this church that I was going to in the neighborhood was similar to that. So it didn't feel foreign or anything. And at that age, and on top of that, I joined a children's choir at the church in our neighborhood. Like, I just joined with my neighbors. So I was familiar with the church structure as well from that. So it didn't feel too different, but it was more, the sermon was much longer. Well, there was a real sermon. So there's that. There was, a 40-minute sermon or whatever. And you had on either end some worship songs and announcements and prayer times and stuff like that. And I was very involved in that church. Both my brother and I were very involved, playing on the worship team and with youth group and leading Sunday school and working in day camps and stuff. We were very involved with that church. So.
Okay. And so from that point forward, you're there for a period of time, but eventually you came across the Orthodox Church. So walk us through that progression.
So around high school age, I stopped attending church every Sunday. I think I got busy with many things. I was also dating a fellow who wasn't necessarily a churchgoer. So there were a few years that it just wasn't my kind of priority, I suppose. I never stopped believing in God ever, but I think also had some friendships or something that kind of got a little rocky at that one church. So then you're kind of floating, and then if you don't land somewhere, you just kind of stay floating. And so that was what was happening. And I started going to university at Ambrose University in Calgary, which is a faith-based university. And I also was no longer dating this fellow. So my Sundays were totally my own, I guess. I don't know. But I started thinking more and more that, okay, maybe I should go back to church. So two of my brothers and I, we decided we would start going back to church together. And that was really nice. Like, it was really nice that we were able to do that together. And so we started kind of doing that, I hate the term, the church shopping thing. It's like my least favorite term in the world, but unfortunately, it's a little bit of an accurate term. So, but okay, so started doing that, and we were going to mostly Protestant churches similar to ones we had gone to, or ones that our friends were going to, just whatever seemed to kind of come up. And we were I think all three of us were starting to feel a little, there were things that we were starting to see now that we had come back to it, that we thought we were just thinking, well, that's maybe not exactly what we're looking for. Also, by the way, tell me if it gets too loud. It's starting to like thunder and lightning out there. So if there's too much rain noise or anything, just tell me, okay? I'll try to, I don't know, change my mic or something like that.
Well, if there's a power outage, we know what happened.
Yeah, exactly. So, okay, so we, and for me, okay, I'll just talk from my side because, I don't know, maybe you'll interview my brothers, I don't know, but I shouldn't spill the beans. But, okay, so from my side, my initial question was always about the music, because, and I think you maybe touched on some of this in your interview with Deacon Jonathan Goosen, a little bit about music and the arts. So tell me if I'm repeating anything. But for me, it was always kind of, okay, how is the music being created? What is the music saying? What's the purpose of the music? How's it being performed? These were always questions that were kind of just lingering in the back of my head. And so I've spent a lot of time in classical music at this point, and other genres, but classical, I think, is like, it's very directly linked to the church historically, the composition style and everything. So I was just, okay, well, I guess one thing that happened was I encountered in a music history class, I encountered a quotation of St. Augustine, where he's talking about how he's listening to music in church and how he feels bad when the pleasure of the music is so basically overwhelming that he kind of forgets the words, let's say. And that's especially bad because the whole point of music in church at that time was to help you memorize and internalize the words. So it's a little bit like, you know, he says, I confess that this is a most grievous sin. And anyway, and he says, now you see my condition, he says, and he takes it so seriously. I was totally struck by this quotation because I thought, first of all, it's so nice. It's so nice that he takes it so seriously, like that he really is thinking about the role of the music, the purpose of the music, the good things, the bad things, potential bad things. And so that struck me too. I thought, oh, I wish we still took music that seriously in church. So that, I think, was one of the first kind of little stepping stones. I also loved St. Augustine after that. And I mean, not going into the Orthodox kind of, you know, St. Augustine, Blessed Augustine, you know, okay, taking, for, let's just say, you know, we might not agree with something everyone says. However, there's real value in reading Western saints as well. And I don't know, again, I'm not a theologian or anything close, so I don't know the details of that. But I got a copy of St. Augustine's Confessions, and really that was also kind of pivotal for me. I just thought, wow, he takes everything so seriously. He's really thinking of it, and he wants to find the truth. So that was kind of, I think, the first part for me. So then I started kind of questioning some other things. I started thinking, oh, you know, confession might be a valuable tool. And then I started thinking about how we approach communion and how we are doing communion. Because at this time, I was going to some churches that didn't do communion every week. They sometimes wouldn't even do it every month. So I was starting to, okay, what's the purpose of communion? What is communion? And why have some churches chosen to not do it anymore? At least not do it as the primary kind of, let's say, act, sacrament in your Sunday service. So yeah, these things were just starting to creep in. There were other things. Creep is not the right word. These things were starting to emerge, and there were other things emerging too. Especially, it's my brothers and I struggled, I think, with the kind of trendiness of some of the churches that we were going to, where it felt a little bit like you had to fit in. You had to wear certain types of clothing. A lot of that had to do with the fact that churches had just young adult services. So there was, in some ways, also missing a kind of intergenerational church experience, which we grew up with, right? Like we grew up with totally intergenerational church experience. So anyway, I think the questions were they were starting to come in. And I would say they got stronger and stronger to a point that it was like, I just don't think we're finding it here. Just don't think we're finding it here. And my brothers and I talked about becoming Catholic, which was, my mom grew up Catholic and chose to become Protestant. So we were like, oh no, it's just like, what's going to happen? And so we talked to our oldest brother, who lived in Toronto at the time, and he said, well, why don't you try this English-speaking Orthodox church? He had met one of the priests at a street festival or something in Calgary, and he said, why don't you just try that? And at that time, I wasn't even really aware of Orthodox versus Catholic. That was very, very, very new to me. So I thought, okay, Orthodox, what is that? So I looked it up a little bit, tried to get a bit of an understanding. And so my brothers and I chose to go one Sunday. I think it was that following Sunday. And well, we walked in. One of the priests at the time, he's at a different church now, but his wife was at the door and she welcomed us, looked at us a little bit curiously, I think, because I think at this time we were like 19, 20, around there. And this would have been in 2013, I think. So yeah, well, I think 10 years ago now. And we just never left. I mean, obviously we left that one church building. That church building doesn't exist anymore, actually. So we definitely left that church building, but we never left the Orthodox Church. It felt so, we just walked in and knew, basically, the three of us.
Yeah.
And
okay,
the three of us were baptized, I think we were baptized altogether about a year and a half later or something like that.
Okay. So just a couple things kind of came up throughout that conversation that I wanted to touch on. So St. Augustine, obviously very foundational saint in the Western Church, but also a saint in the Eastern Church. It's just that his nickname is Blessed Augustine. So sometimes people will look at that and think that, oh, he's not really a saint, but in actual fact, he is. His works get translated pretty late into the Greek-speaking part of the world. It's only really in the 1300s, actually, at the same time that like St. Thomas Aquinas is translated over, who's another, he's just a Catholic saint, but very prominent voice there. But St. Augustine is super helpful, I find. So it's also, this phrase from him isn't, I think it's apocryphal, like it's falsely attributed to him, but there is a phrase that attributed to him that says, when you sing, you pray twice, which is a really nice way of putting it, because it does amplify it. And I think even if it's not accurate in the sense of him speaking it at some point, I think it does convey a theological truth that's helpful. But so communion and music sounds like those were the two big things that were on your radar. And did you have a sense initially of what you were looking for? Because from what you've said so far, it sounded like you were starting to become uneasy or unsure of what you were seeing practiced, but did you have a sense of what you hoped to have as a practice?
Yes, I don't think I had a sense of what that practice would look like, but I think that one thing that I was thinking a lot at that time is, okay, I wanted to take my faith more seriously. I really wanted to get to the root of things, really try to understand historically, let's say, partly historically, but traditionally, what Christians have done and why. And I felt a little bit going to the churches that I was going to that it seemed almost like they were not as interested in digging to the deep roots of it. Now, there were some pastors and such, of course, who were interested in that, but it didn't always seem to then play out into the practice. So I think part of it was this, that I wanted to really take my faith seriously and figure out as much about it as possible. And then, but another thing was that I wanted to join something that wasn't going to change just to appeal to people. That was a big factor for me, because I think part of what I was seeing is that kind of in the contrast, let's say, between my parents' church that I grew up in and the one that they both still exist, but let's say then the kind of resulting church, which was more modern, and both of those churches have many people and do many great things. Okay, so this is not in any way meant to be disparaging. But what I saw was, okay, my parents' church was older, right? They had their way of doing things. It was a bit more traditional. And then this church was attempting to appeal to other people, a younger generation, let's say, or a different generation, I don't know. And as a result, I felt like they lost something. I felt like they lost a great amount of things, actually. And so I think I kept seeing that over and over. It's like, oh, we're going to change this. Oh, we're going to change this. And in my work, like I said, I worked in worship bands and stuff like that. I saw that all the time on the music side, because of course the music is popular music in style. And we know with popular music, it gets old very, very fast, right? It gets old in a few months. So you have to keep changing it out to make room for the new stuff that people are going to find appealing. So that's just an example of one area of church that happens. But that happens all the time. And I think I was just feeling like, no, I want to join something that is going to stay the same regardless of whether I choose to join or not. That is actually, that has its tradition, that has its method. And of course, there are going to be different, cultural traditions around that and stuff like that. Like, it's not going to look exactly the same, but that they have the core, and that I just join that. And I don't have to create it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's also, I think, the psychological sense that you can have a sense of security there in a positive sense. Like, you don't need to always be on guard against the potential threats because things are being changed at such a rapid rate. You can actually entrust yourself to something. So it sounds, just to summarize, like, and maybe to put it in slightly different words, that in these churches that you're a part of, they were seeking to be accessible, but the accessibility was problematic in that it had a short shelf life. And you described that with the music, because it's only good, the more comprehensible it is immediately, which is how accessible something is, the shorter time span you have with that thing, because you just comprehend it and then you get bored intellectually and you want to move on to something else. So actually, it's good in a way to have something that's not quite as accessible, because it can have a certain level of depth that can sustain you for a long period of time. So it sounds like that's what you found within Orthodoxy. And then it also sounds like the topic of the medium is the message that was the subject in Deacon John's discussion, where by adopting these mediums, some of the churches were seeking to engage with the secular culture. They were trying, again, to make things as accessible as possible. But the twisted thing, or the surprising thing about that, is there isn't just a blank sort of neutral medium. And so as you enter these things, there's a real question of, are you reaching the people that are secular, or are you secularizing the church and actually changing the DNA of it?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It is both those things. Exactly. Because accessibility is it's an interesting term. I think it's an interesting term because I don't think it's quite, I think that it is what oftentimes is being shot for. But I think what ends up happening is that of course, as I mentioned before, you lose something, you lose the depth, you might lose some of that kind of theological underpinning of the text, which is, of course, what the text and music were there for to begin with. But on top of that, it actually also becomes less relevant to people, because the reason it's accessible, ideally, this is the same with popular music, right? The music is familiar off the bat, so you can kind of connect to it. You kind of know, okay, I recognize this. There's some familiarity. You understand the style. You're not kind of thrown into a weird, like you're listening to like modern 20th century music or something, and you're like in a corner alone, knowing nothing about the world or something. It's not that. It's like very familiar. You understand the language, let's say, of the music. But then on top of that, the words also the text ends up being more about, as popular music is, kind of just like personal, everyday, maybe, a relationship, or maybe like heartbreak, kind of general things that we might experience in our lives. And it's because everyone's going to experience things like love and heartbreak and such in their lives. So if we make it kind of generally about that, then everyone can relate. But I do think and of course on the church side, it's not necessarily talking about relationships and breakups and stuff like that, but it keeps a lot of these same kind of, I would say, I don't want to sound like elitist or something, but it keeps a little bit of the kind of surface level emotions or surface level theological depth or something, or faith, spiritual depth. Kind of keeps it surface level, because then it's like, oh, everyone can enter in how they want to enter in. But I actually think in the end it makes it a little bit less relevant and actually harder to enter in, because it doesn't come straight to the core, which takes time. As you mentioned, it's something that you as you interact with these pieces over and over. Let's say in the Orthodox Church, the hymns, they take on different meaning, they take on different shape to you. You notice a word for the first time after 10 years. There's a lot of depth to them. But I would say, honestly, like, all of this to me just points again to in the Orthodox Church, one thing I noticed when I came in, it's like, okay, we're trying to do every area to the best of our ability and the best of our knowledge in the tradition. And so music is just one of those areas, but it's like we're really taking it seriously and not just kind of letting it happen the way that the culture does, or the way music happens in the secular world. We're really thinking about it, and we're really trying to make it the best we possibly can. And I think that for me was just it resonated with me in that time of, I just really wanted to take things seriously and take them to the like root, if that makes sense.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think something that comes to mind is that within an Orthodox setting or within a Catholic setting, there is a certain appreciation for ritual action. And so I think that is on the radar in a way that it might not be to the same degree within a Protestant setting, because within Protestantism, the word, as in like what you read on a page, is emphasized so much that there's not as much attention paid to the ritual actions. Even though they exist within the Protestant setting, there are ritual actions that are occurring in the corporate gathering, but I don't think that there is as much of like a filter for them or a category to place those things in. And so it would make sense from that perspective that within Orthodoxy, they're not just concerned about the words that are said, but they're also concerned about how they're said, how they're communicated in terms of the music that's being used, or the art that's up on the walls and the paintings and so forth, as well as how people are just genuflecting and crossing themselves and bowing down. Like it takes account of those things in a way that I think isn't as emphasized within Protestantism. Again, and that's meant just to be as an observation, not necessarily like a scathing critique. I think that's just part of the DNA that's different between the two branches.
Yeah, because they do have their tradition. Like they do have their, like it is a tradition that they are operating in. Because like you can go from one church to the next and you're going to see a lot of the same structure of the service, a lot of the same worship music, this type of thing. It's just how they come to that tradition and how it's different, right? It's just that it's a different approach, and it's a shorter tradition, it's newer, and how they choose it is a little bit more flexible, I think. And I think part of it too, like I mentioned with my parents' church, there was a kind of, it was in some ways there was a lot of structure and ritual in the sense that of how the service itself operated. And I think that, again, that's something that I that I think had an impact is that, okay, this is how we do it. Now we do a prayer. Now we do a hymn. Now we do a reflection. Now so-and-so requests this. Like, it was this kind of like step by step. Then we had communion about 3/4 of the way through, so it was always this kind of, it had this, a very kind of specific structure, yet flexible. So I think that whereas in the churches that I went to later, it was much more about the sermon. The sermon was the central part. And, you had your little things on each end, like worship songs and stuff like that. So, but I think, I don't mean to spend most of the time talking about music, because it's more than that. But for me, since I'm a musician, I come from inside that world. So those are the things I see first. And those are the things I probably react most intensely to. And so when I started going to the Orthodox Church, it was not long before I started singing in the choir. I think it was like my second week or something. And that's one thing I was going to say that really struck me too about joining the Orthodox Church, was that pretty much right away, your skills were like valued and people requested that you serve in some way. And I think that made, not only does it make you feel like you're contributing and that you're offering and that you're serving, but it also really makes you feel like you're important and that you're even seen in the church setting, which of course I know can happen and has happened to me in the past, where you attend a church and it's like nobody saw you. You could have come and gone, nobody would have known. You could have, nobody's ever asked you for help. Nobody's ever asked you to contribute in some way other than tithing. So it's like, and nobody's asked you directly, like, hey, can you do this? Can you help me with this? We need help in the nursery, or we need help. So there's something about that kind of real, like, it was like we came in and right away, there was this kind of feeling of, okay, what ways do you want to serve? And that was a really, I think that made a real impact on me as well, because it made me, because I think that's like, okay, I wanted to take things seriously. I wanted to, I've said that phrase so many times, I wanted to take it seriously, but what does it mean to take it seriously? Like, does it just mean to like read theology all day? I mean, maybe it could, I don't know, but I just mean, like, what could it mean when somebody wants to take something seriously? And I think for me, it's like, I wanted to be able to contribute. I wanted to be able to really feel like I was part of something and contributing to the whole and helping where there was a need. And I think that that's one thing. I mean, anywhere you go, any church you go to, pretty much is going to need help with music. Like, there's always musical needs. Like, so in some ways, I'm in a kind of good field for that, because it's like, especially Orthodox churches, it's like, we need singers. We really need singers. And that, by the way, is one of the Orthodox Church's modes of accessibility for music, is that it's all sung. You don't have to know how to play an instrument. You don't have to have any really musical upbringing. I mean, obviously there's some, like, some factors, like, do you like to sing? Have you sung before? Do you want to come join us and give it a try? Is it working? So there are factors, of course, but there is some serious accessibility there. It's like, we all have, well, most of us are born able to sing, right? So that's an accessibility factor that is sometimes not present in other churches that have worship bands, because you have to learn an instrument. Now, there are also singers. There's lead singers and stuff like that too. So, but there's only room for, like, let's say 1 to 3, right? On any given Sunday. So there was something to that for me as well, that I really felt like, wow, I can contribute to this choir and I can learn the music this way and also help them if they need somebody or need a reader or something like that. So, and not long after, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks in, one of the priests asked me to come sing a wedding that he was asked to do. And so just like his wife and I and one other, we went to go do this wedding. And like, I had no idea what I was doing, but I knew the music. Like I knew I could do the music, and they were just telling me, okay, next is Lord Have Mercy. Okay, next is, so they're just like kind of guiding me along. And then they took me for ice cream after at Dairy Queen. These little experiences that you have that make such a difference. But even before then, I knew that it was like, this is a place that I can really, I can kind of dig into and commit to.
Mm. And for anyone listening or watching, when Bronwyn's speaking about the accessibility of Orthodoxy in terms of the ability to sing, like Protestant settings, Catholic churches, Orthodox churches, they all would have congregational singing. However, the actual setting or the structure in Orthodoxy is a choir, usually somewhere in the church building, and that can grow quite large. And so it's really easy for someone, as in Bronwyn's case, when they're just fresh, to go right in and join the choir and to start singing. Whereas in some other settings, like say a Protestant church, it is more formal in that you have like a worship band and you've got to maybe audition for that or be part of the congregation for a period of time before you're up on the stage leading. So were there other reasons that were apparent to you when you joined Orthodoxy, like other reasons why you chose to make the leap over?
Oh yeah, probably. Yes, many. I think I mean the thing is I was looking through one of my old journals from around that time, and I was like, oh wow, I thought I remembered one page where I kind of listed everything. No. But I tried to think about, okay, what are some of the kind of main things? And I think one other thing that I kind of alluded to earlier with the intergenerational okay, so the general thing that I was going to say, which I think is true, is that when I started going to the Orthodox Church, I encountered Christ in a different way than I had before. And part of this was through observing how people were treating each other in the Orthodox Church and how people were serving. Just going back to that, lots of people found different ways to serve using their own skills, whatever they have. But it was that servitude is related to the love that I think people were showing to one another. Now, obviously we're human, and sometimes, so I'm not trying to paint some perfect picture where you like walk in and everyone's like happy and everything like that. But one thing I noticed about this was, I think it was related to this kind of intergenerational experience that you have. I'm a big fan of mixed age groups. Like, I'm a huge fan for all things, for education, mostly for education, like children's education and such. I'm always looking for things that have mixed age groups, because the younger ones learn from the older ones practice nurturing for the younger, then the younger really care for the older. So you have all of these opportunities to learn and grow and love each other. So that's what I saw in the Orthodox Church. It was a big mixed age group. I mean, I wasn't thinking about it in those terms at the time, but that's what I'm thinking of now. And, the kids stay in the service. The children don't go down to Sunday school during the liturgy. That made an impression on me, because I thought, well, actually, that was a lot of my experience growing up. We didn't have Sunday school during that service, so we stayed with our parents. That's what we did. Sometimes they did develop a Sunday school and stuff. Sometimes we did go in the later, but either way, for the most part, it's like we had that experience of being with our parents, taking communion with our parents. So the children stay in the service. There's no young adult specific liturgy. There's no, seniors only liturgy or something like that. So it's very mixed. And that calls people to practice many different forms of love and servitude. And I think that was another thing that made me feel like, oh, this is what Christ is calling us to do. Like, this is what we're meant to do. We're meant to be with people of different generations. We're meant to be with people of different difficulties and such. And I did notice that too. I noticed that there were sometimes people in church that I don't think would have been really welcomed into other churches. And I noticed that right away too, that there were some people, whether it be people who come for the lunch after people who come, maybe homeless people who are coming to the lunches on Sunday after liturgy, something like this. These were people that I wondered sometimes if they would have been accepted in some of the other church gatherings. And that also, I think, made an impact on me too, because of course we are called to love and serve those in need. And so again, I feel like I felt that opportunity at the Orthodox Church just to help serve with the kids, with the elderly, with those who are sick, maybe people who are homeless. It seemed like, okay, we all know each other, and we all know what people's needs are, and so we can help in that way. We're not segregated.
Yeah, it makes me think about the stories of God's people in Scripture. So you've got the Old Testament, which is the people of Israel, and you've got the New Testament, which are like the disciples of Christ and the continuation of Israel. And in either case, it's a group of people that's being saved. And there are specific individuals that have a prominent role to play within that group, but it's always a group nevertheless. So you don't just have these detached people that are islands unto themselves. It's always that God is saving a people. So it's nice to see that that's reflected within the Orthodox Church. And another thing it kind of makes me think about, I've been listening to some lectures where Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Pajot are speaking. And one of the things that Jonathan Pajot mentions is this interpretation of some of the Old Testament laws where you wouldn't harvest right until the end of your plot of land, and you would leave that for the foreigner and the stranger. And but there's one interpretation of that that's just like the literal one in terms of you're caring for the needy, which goes to the point about having these lunches and people can come afterwards to partake of that. But also it has like a theological point about not having complete order over everything, that there's this part of the world that you leave to God, or you're not making everything just perfect and in line. And I think that that's also expressed in this notion of, you do find occasionally at Orthodox churches people that might not be accepted elsewhere. And I think they're at best, this isn't going to be the case everywhere, of course, because of human frailty and so forth, but at best the Orthodox Church can be a place where you've got all sorts of people there. And for someone who's not familiar with an Orthodox service, usually there is the more formal liturgy that happens, and afterwards there's often a lunch that everyone takes part in. And I mean, part of that is just practical because there's the practice of fasting before the service, and so no one's really had breakfast, and they're all going to faint otherwise, so you need some sustenance. But then there's this wonderful thing that happens where you're able to connect with people afterwards, and even a theological point in the sense that you give to God what is God's, and then you love other people around you. And so there's that love of God and love of neighbor that's really exemplified. In any case, thank you for that summary of why you joined the Orthodox Church. But I'm curious, were there certain challenges that you initially faced? And one of them that I want to throw in there, and maybe it wasn't an issue, but obviously you are an instrumentalist, like you know how to play instruments, and that is not something that really factors into Orthodox worship. It's just voices singing, there's no accompaniment. Was that a challenge, or were there other challenges that you had to face?
Honestly, I know this is probably not, I don't know. I really feel like I did not have many challenges at all at that time. Regarding the being an instrumentalist, well, I always loved to sing too. So that wasn't really I always loved to sing, and singing a cappella, so singing with no instrumental accompaniment, it's like, it's very fun. So I always enjoyed that anyway. And to some extent, I will say, I also appreciated knowing that, okay, nobody's going to ask me to play piano next Sunday. There was a little, when you do something for your life and you love it, it's hard sometimes to do work to have those things mix. It is a little bit like your work and your church. It's a little bit tricky. So in some ways, I was at that time very open I was okay with there not being instruments. The instrument of the voice is the perfect instrument. We can have text. So it's totally practical, and it just made sense to me. And I love to sing. So I don't think it was too hard. It was definitely something that I think at that time I thought, this is kind of nice. So, which is funny because I love playing my instrument, but for some reason at that time, that's how I felt. But I think for me, the trouble did come a little bit later when I was offered a job in the church as a choir director. That was a bit, and I'm not talking volunteer because I always did volunteer choir directing before, but when I was offered the role and a job. So that was, I think, where most of my challenges came, was that, okay, this is now I feel uncomfortable. Now I'm starting to feel like, oh, like getting paid to be there, so that was, I think, where more of my challenges came up. I think that in some ways, the challenges that I faced came more before I started the Orthodox Church, where I started going to the Orthodox Church, where it was more about just finding my faith and feeling a little bit like I was floating and really quite conflicted. I feel like that's where my challenges mostly were. And then coming into the Orthodox faith, I felt at that time like I had a grace period, literally, where it was just, okay, now you're here. And I think for me, that period lasted a long time. I think it still is going on. But I think then I had some challenges later personally once I started getting more and more involved in the church. And perhaps some of those challenges happen earlier for some people as you get more involved in the church. And I didn't have this problem, but I see this problem now. See, I think part of the reason is I actually didn't know much about Orthodoxy before going to the Orthodox Church. Once I started going, we met the priest, we had conversations, they lent us books. This was my introduction to Orthodoxy. So I had looked it up before. I was like, oh, what's that? That was about the extent of it. And I think what I see a lot happening now that is different from when I came in is that people go in knowing a lot about Orthodoxy. I mean, that's like, I feel bad saying that's a problem. It's obviously, it's in many ways for people, that's a gift to have all that knowledge already. But I think one of the things that part of this grace period that I think I had was that I didn't have expectations and I didn't have ideals. Other than just, I'm looking for a place, like I mentioned, I'm looking for a place I can take seriously, where I can serve these types of things, that they seem to take communion seriously, that they think about these things, they seek the root. That's the kind of general thing that I was looking for. And I felt like I struck gold, But I think now a lot of my friends I see coming in, they know what they're looking for. They know very detailed, in a lot of detail, what they're looking for. And I think that could be a real struggle for some when you start interacting with the church in reality and you discover that clergy's not perfect, congregations aren't perfect, sometimes the building's not perfect, sometimes the music's not perfect. And so you're just like, I think that could be a very difficult thing that people would face, and I've seen it now, but I think in some ways I was kind of spared from that at the time, just by nature of where I was when I was coming in. I think I was coming in from a less educated standpoint.
Right. And so the main challenge, if I can summarize it and you tell me if it's accurate, is when you were offered a position that was paid, now there were mixed motivations in attending church because you wanted to be there as an Orthodox Christian, but also you were receiving financial benefits from that. And it sounds similar to working for your family, where all of a sudden you've got these different levels of relationship to balance, and that can be stressful. Is that the sense you're getting at?
Yes. Thanks for rounding it back to the actual question that you asked. Yes, that was that. I think if I'm remembering correctly, I do think that was my that has been my largest challenge. So it's that it comes from a certain level of guilt, you know. See, the thing is, clergy, they know the church is going to be my job. They know this. They spend time thinking about it. They spend time praying about it. They have guidance. They have people who have said to them, look, this is going to happen. This is hard. These are some ways to navigate it. They have bishops. They have people. When you're a choir director, they just call you and say, hey, can you do this? And it's depending on the church. It might be just a volunteer position. They need somebody, and that's fantastic. But some churches have much more of, let's say, music programs and stuff. They want you to, and they have the vision, and they want to see it. They want to see it kind of pan out. So it's going to be much more of a job. Like, you're going to spend many, many more hours on it, and so for that reason, they want to pay. And I think that I haven't fully gotten to the kind of center of that. But that was a hard transition for me, because I felt like, I've put in so many hours, of course, but I constantly have this kind of feeling in the back of my head of, you're taking money from the church. I constantly have that. I don't know if that'll ever go away. I don't know.
Oh, interesting. People give to the church for a reason, I suppose, and
Absolutely.
having it be able to function would be one of those reasons. So
Yeah.
I imagine
No,
there shouldn't be any
absolutely.
guilt,
It's
but
so tricky. I know, but it's very tricky. I don't know how to describe it, because I think for me it was such a, like, kind of going back, it's like I was talking so much about serving the church. Like, I just love to do the music. I just love to do that. And that felt like that was my giving. That's what I could give. And so then it does complicate things when suddenly there's a paycheck involved. Now, I'm not saying like that people should not take paying jobs in the church or something like that. And obviously in most Protestant churches, for example, there's so many paid positions depending on the church. So it's like, I'm not trying to say that means everyone should feel guilty or something. But I think for me, I've just had a difficult time kind of just merging those two. I'm figuring it out. We can circle back to it in a year or so and see.
Yeah, but I get the sense in that you want to sacrifice something of value to the church, and then it does complicate it if you're partaking of the sacrifice in a way.
Yeah.
So one thing before we get to the final question is, you mentioned this challenge that some other people face when they've done a lot of reading about Orthodoxy and then they come into the church because they've developed an ideal vision, and then that doesn't match the reality, which seems inevitable in the sense that whenever a book is written, it's talking in an abstract way and things are cleaned up because you want to make it so people can actually digest the content. You can't just talk about 1,000 particulars. And usually, not always, but usually the people that actually have their books published and are distributed and are known are people that are fairly good articulators of the faith. And so there can also be a discrepancy there when you have been reading that sort of stuff and then you come to a local parish and it's not the same caliber of sermon that the priest is delivering. There's just different levels of skill, and that's just the way the world is. But would you have, I'm going to segue this into the last question. So for people that are exploring the Orthodox Church or are interested in Orthodoxy, bearing that question in mind, but also any other advice that you may have, what would be your recommendation to them?
No, it's such a tricky thing, but I do think so. I think I have well, it's so good that people are learning about these things. It's so good, and it's so great that they're learning about it, and that makes them want to go try a church. And you're right that oftentimes the people talking about it are the people who have found the beauty of it. And they are not necessarily going to talk about the nitty-gritty of human interaction that's going to happen anytime you're in a group. Like, they're not always going to talk about, like what you said about, that, sometimes priests have different skills, that congregations have totally different characters and stuff like that, congregation members. And that sometimes there might be someone in a group who's very hard to deal with or something. And again, this could happen anywhere. So I think one of the main things that I also think I was part of my grace period. And so I hate that I use that term, but I also love it. So I'm going to just stick with it for now. But I think part of it was the church that I went to was the only English-speaking Orthodox church in our city. And so for us, there was no question a little bit. It was like, we weren't going to try another church. We wanted to learn the liturgy. So we wanted to go to an English-speaking parish. And so for us, it was kind of like, this is the one, this is what we're going to do. But I do see, I'm here in Montreal. There's a lot of churches in Montreal. There's a lot of churches of different archdioceses, different, you have a lot of different languages, but also a lot of English. And also a lot of people who understand different languages too, which was, that's another factor. So I think sometimes you see, as newer people are coming into the church and seeking that ideal, let's say, that they're looking for. Ideal might not be the right word, but vision of what they have that it could be. Sometimes I've seen some newer catechumens or potential catechumens, they'll go, it's like, okay, I went to this church for a month, and then I went to this church for a month, and then I went to this church for a month. And what that ends up kind of being is it's a little bit like, to go back to what we started with, it's a little bit like that church shopping situation. So I think, in some ways it's good. Try out a couple churches, get a vibe. It's good. But I do think, one piece of advice that I would maybe give is for consideration would be to, within your, second month or something, let's say you've tried a couple churches just to see, like, okay, are they English, like just to figure out the basic kind of feelings of each. Choose one and really commit to that church for like a year. Give yourself a timeline, because I think this, at least for me, just having to commit to a church, it really helps me grow in my faith, because it was like, okay, whatever you're going to interact, the difficulties and stuff like that, whatever you're going to encounter, like difficulties, stuff that's good, stuff that's harder, stuff you didn't expect, it doesn't chase you away. It's just, okay, we're going to figure out how to do this. Why is this happening here? And is this really a reflection of, the faith, or is it just a reflection of, people being in groups and things happening? And so I guess what I'm trying to say is I feel like I benefited from the necessity of having to commit to one church, one parish right away. I feel like I benefited from that. And so it's something that might be a consideration for new churchgoers is to just give yourself a timeline and try to stick with it and stay there and get to know the priest and get to know the people of different generations, both born Orthodox, people converted, people from different countries. Really try to get into the community, seek whatever ways that you can serve and feel like you are contributing to that community. And I think that will help. Is I think one other tiny issue, and I know we're kind of running on time, so you can just interrupt me if you want.
No, go ahead.
But one other thing that I think is difficult that also I didn't encounter. So when my brothers and I started going to the church, we were the only young people there that I can remember for at least a year. And that could have just been that church, right? Like it was also, I don't know why. But now there are so many incoming young adults. That's a good thing. But I do think in some ways what can happen is that segregation, where now the only people we talk to are young adults. And, we spend most of our time talking about theology with other young adults, some of whom are new to the faith, some of whom maybe were baptized recently, who knows? But it's like that also, I think, can be a little bit of you're just not maybe experiencing the fullness of what that parish might have to offer if you were to, for example, really get involved in some of the activities that they have in the church that are more intergenerational, I guess, is what I'm trying. There I go, back again on mixed age groups. But so I guess those are my two kind of points. So committing to your parish, committing to a parish, once you feel like you can, as early as possible, really just trying to stick with that and go in deep, try to serve, get to know everyone, do what you can. And then on the other side of that, while we all enjoy young adults events and such, really just prioritize your relationship with your priest, and as well as other people in the congregation who may have a different, totally different path from you and generational experience and everything. So those that maybe are my two pieces of advice.
Well, it's a wonderful place to conclude for today, Bronwyn. So I want to thank you for your time. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you so much. I hope you have a great day. Thanks everyone for listening.
Hey guys, thanks for checking out that episode of the Orthodox Christian Podcast. If you have a question about Orthodox Christianity, there is a link to a form in the video description that you can check out. Also, if you haven't yet liked or subscribed a video, please do. It really helps. And if you know someone that would benefit from watching this episode, feel free to pass it along to them. In the meantime, I hope that you have a peaceful week. Take care.